Welcome to Melanated ADHD. I'm your host, Annette. This podcast was created out of a genuine interest to profile and elevate BIPOC voices living with ADHD, with a special focus on Black and Brown women. By doing so, we look to reshape perceptions of how ADHD impacts our communities and explore pathways to flourish and thrive together. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the episode. So thank you for joining us. I'm quite excited to invite and introduce you all to our guest for today's episode. Her name is Christa, writer, project manager, Kentuckian. Welcome to Melanated ADHD.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat with you.
So I'm hoping to learn a little bit more about your story through some of the prompts that I've sent you over, but just to kind of kick things off, what were some of those first signs of or symptoms that made you suspect that you might have ADHD?
Yeah, so for me, the first sign was my doctor told me. I was definitely I wasn't diagnosed until adulthood. You know, I had been dealing with depression, anxiety for a number of years, not realizing that the root cause could have been this other diagnosis. So the first signs for me were external folks letting me know that, hey, you know, we've done this comprehensive testing. You've come in basically. Okay, so starting with the anxiety and depression, I had been treated for that. Had been sort of working with my healthcare providers to treat that, and sort of like what you said, we couldn't quite crack the code. So when we did do the comprehensive testing, and ADHD was one of the diagnoses, it kind of just made sense. So yeah, it really was that external stimulus to say these challenges that you're having, yes, anxiety and depression are a challenge that you're dealing with, but the root cause is actually one of these other diagnoses. I didn't think I was nervous, but I guess I am. um, so yeah, I mean, growing up, I was not the image of ADHD that you normally have. And so it was that external source that tipped me off to let me know that some of the things that I was dealing with, the challenges that I was having, could be traced back to the diagnosis of ADHD.
And you know what? That resonates with me because I didn't necessarily know until I started hearing voices online talk
Mhm.
about their symptoms. And so that's when it was like an aha moment for me because, yes, similar to you, I was with my medical practitioner trying to figure out what is it? Like I was saying, this is a track record I have, and let's figure this out together. And it took years, but I definitely can empathize with you with that piece for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you say that, do you mean like here's the track record, here's the things that I've been struggling with, and
Yeah.
then, tracing it back to the root, what is actually causing it? Yeah, it's definitely been an ongoing process. And I'm still learning every day. It feels like something new, or I'm encountering my behavior or a way I approach a situation, and I'm able to say, oh, okay, this might be the way I'm experiencing this, the way that I'm working through this, the challenges might be coming from ADHD. And that's kind of a weight off a little bit also to be able to trace it back to that. It gives some in the moment sort of levity. So that's been an interesting part of the process of being diagnosed.
And so I'm curious, like, how did you differentiate what might be typical behavior and what was like a sign of ADHD? Because I know you're mentioning about different symptoms and what people are telling you, but how did you know?
So for me, it's all been retroactive for me, right? Um, so being diagnosed in my 30th year of life, you start to look back at your behaviors and the way that you navigate the world. And, it was sort of like a race against, I felt like I was racing, right? To sort of figure out everything that I had ever done wrong. And, how can my treatment for ADHD help me with those things? So if I think about losing my phone all the time or losing my train of thought often or interrupting people in conversations. I've always sort of dug into, I don't know why I'm just completely blanking at this point. You know what? It
Maybe,
might be the ADHD. In high stress situations, it kind of comes through.
oh yeah,
Um,
the fawning. Yeah.
so I by nature am just a very inquisitive person, and I always want to know the why of things, and I spend a lot of time kind of digging into the why of things. I think that contributes a lot to when I interrupt folks in conversations. I find myself doing that. I think the value of having ADHD as sort of one aspect of my identity that I can look to is it feels like a traceable reason for some of the things that I struggle with, right? Maybe I misplaced my phone 5 times in the period of half of a day, right? And I might feel really frustrated about that. I might be like, I'm so forgetful. And that's kind of a trivial, not too serious thing. But in the moment, being able to trace that to ADHD, being able to take a second and step back and say, I'm not just a forgetful person just because I am. Maybe I'm experiencing levels of stress or anxiety that's disrupting my executive function. Just having that train of thought ready at hand when I do start to experience the frustration of little things like that is really helpful. But it also, it applies to much bigger things too, the things that affect my sense of self-worth. So, for example, procrastinating, right? Like in school, in workplaces, I've always delivered results and folks have been happy with those results. I've been happy with those results, but there's always been a little bit of an undercurrent or disappointment, I guess, in how I achieve those results. And similar to, losing my phone, right? That's a little trivial, but it's really helpful in those really high stress moments where I might be disappointed in myself or frustrated with the way that I'm approaching a certain project. Um, it's nice to have ADHD as, like I said, just one facet of myself and my mind that I can trace. And so that's the why in a lot of situations. Um, and it's just nice to have that definite why sometimes.
Yeah. And you know what? Like as you're talking and you mentioned about, forgetting your phone, like the things that seem very trivial, I think in the grand scheme of things, and when you look back, I know also for myself, I realized that yes, I would have misplaced the parking ticket I just paid
Mhm.
for and put it in my pocket. But then when I get to the machine to get out with the little arm thingy to get out of the parking lot, I completely forget. So I forget where I put it. And I remember being in the car with my friends and they're all looking at me like, well, how do you not know where you put the ticket you just paid for less than 5 minutes ago?
Yeah.
And so, like, there's that example, or even just the concept of getting tea, something as simple
Mhm.
as going to the kitchen to get tea. And
Yes.
I somehow have already started to put away dishes from the dishwasher, putting
Mm.
away the dishes from the sink,
Mhm.
wiping up the counter mess, and then realizing I want to boil an egg for my husband. Like honestly, it's just and that one task that should have taken less than 10 minutes is now a whole 30-minute production and I haven't gotten my tea. So I get it. When you
The
look back,
kitchen, the kitchen is a problem, let's be honest. There's a lot going on in
yeah.
the kitchen. Um, as far as like having to sustain yourself, I can't tell you the number of times I have left food in the microwave just overnight, or just sometimes when if I'm heating up my lunch in the microwave 4 or 5 times, I have to come back to it. It's things like that and things like laundry, that feel like really, like you said, basic things, that especially when you're in really spaces of high stress or anxiety, it happens over and over and over again.
Yeah.
But even when it's just a simple daily task, Yeah, those little things add up.
And Krista, what would you say? Because I know you kind of touched base on like work and how it shows up at your workplace. Could you expand a bit on that? Like, how does your ADHD symptoms kind of show up at work?
How can I say it? So my ADHD diagnosis came at a time, like I said, it was my 30th year. I'm undergoing, the comprehensive testing. I'm learning about ADHD as well as, other diagnoses. And it kind of around that time, I was also having really significant just external changes in my life, with my housing situation, with my economic situation, and then also just shifting careers, right? Transitioning from um, a space of full-time employment to figuring out what self-employment might look like or freelance employment might look like. And those were things that were sort of set in motion as the ADHD diagnosis was happening.
Gotcha.
So it's been really interesting to undergo such significant transitions while also gaining a deeper understanding of how my brain works. So it that is something that I definitely harp on different things as I retroactively think about in my previous work environment.
Okay, that's fair. Um, Given that you had more of a late diagnosis and
Mhm.
kind of like what you were saying, that you noticed or you were informed that ADHD was possibly the diagnosis for you. Before that, you also mentioned about like the depression and the anxiety piece as part of that journey. I'm maybe just for someone listening in on just understanding your steps that you've taken to getting diagnosed. Perhaps you could shed light on what that looked like what that journey looked like to get to the final diagnosis of ADHD.
Absolutely. So, in 2020, I was working at an agency. When the pandemic hit, we all scattered. We had folks that were working across the country. And, living in Louisville, Kentucky, which is where the murder of Breonna Taylor took place, race was just part of my community's conversation in a way that it hadn't been in my lifetime before. Um, and so in 2020, I made a conscious effort for the first time to shift all of my healthcare providers to Black women. So I had been treated for anxiety and depression for a number of years, and my healthcare providers were great and got me to where I needed to be. But it wasn't until I made that shift that I was able to have a healthcare provider be a little bit more proactive with my health than I was typically used to. So I absolutely think that shifting my healthcare providers to Black women, it removed a barrier that I didn't super realize was there. And it enabled me to let my guard down in a way that I was being more honest, being more transparent with my healthcare providers and showing more of myself, right? Like that was a big part of it too, is once the action of therapy moved away from going into a place and instead I was having virtual appointments with my
Yeah.
healthcare providers, that really shifted things in a way that I didn't expect, right? So my depression and anxiety diagnoses were much more informal, I think, than my diagnosis for ADHD. Um, it came at a point in my life that was a significant transition point, and my coping mechanisms were failing. And so when I went to see my primary care provider, the mental health challenges that I hadn't talked to her about just kind of came flooding out, right? In this moment um, of transition, a big moment of big challenges, right? My defenses were down. And so I was going through the treatment plan for depression and anxiety. And after a period of time, maybe 3 or 4 years, trying a number of different medications, but also, and also, going through psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, my healthcare providers were working with me. And, I don't know, I'm not going to say that I couldn't have stayed with the healthcare providers that I had,
Right.
because I was learning a lot about myself, even with that care. But once I shifted my healthcare providers to Black women, like I said, there was a barrier that removed that I didn't, there was a barrier that was removed that I didn't fully realize was there. And so they were able to be a little bit more proactive with me, and say, okay, Christa has been treated for anxiety and depression for this number of years. Christa is completely compliant with all of our recommendations. Let's start from scratch. Let's start from step one, because I had kind of skipped step one by not undergoing, comprehensive testing before being given a treatment plan, right? So the steps were kind
Right.
of backwards. And so I still kind of feel like I'm in the process of being diagnosed, right? Because your treatment plan is part of, at least to me, it has felt like part of the diagnosis, because I was on a treatment plan before I was diagnosed with ADHD, because I was being treated for anxiety and depression.
And you know what? I wanted to kind of just pause you there. And I thought this was a very powerful statement that you made about switching your providers to Black women who could advocate and remove those barriers for you that you didn't know were there. I had to sit with that piece for a moment because even as we're talking right now, I am also reflecting on my experiences and how when I first went with my list of issues, it was default anxiety and depression, but never once did anyone recommend ADHD. And it makes me just want to think, well, what made you not look at the symptoms of ADHD and equate it to what I'm describing to you as a Black woman?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And so I grew up in rural Kentucky, right? I grew up in small town Kentucky, and I live in a more, metropolitan area now, and in my later childhood. But, you know, as a first generation Nigerian, living in rural Kentucky, growing up, the image of ADHD and ADD, I think, people referred to it at ADD at that time, and actually don't know the specific differences, or, why the labels changed or shift. But the image of ADHD was absolutely not me, right? It's the little kid, it's the little kid with the little white kid with the backwards baseball cap, and maybe he's got
Yeah.
Gatorade staining his teeth, and he's the craziest one on the playground. But there was always something about that personification of ADHD that felt okay. Um, it felt like, oh, this is something that a certain type of person deals with, and that certain type of person looks like this. So on top of that, I grew up with a mother who was an early childhood educator, right? So
Mm-hmm.
she was taught how to recognize signs of ADHD in young people. But the things that she may have been taught were not the things that will show up in me. And so it's been interesting to look back and think back. And it's definitely been a part of my treatment plan, and discussing and trying to talk to family members about, um, what ADHD looks like for me. It's been a really interesting thing to sort of reckon with, when the umbrella is a person that looks a certain way. It's hard to see how you fit into that, because the symptoms, they manifest in different ways. And also, let's be honest, I was really good at the things that typical ADHD folks maybe weren't supposed to be good at. I was focused. I was very diligent with my work. I always got my assignments done on time. A lot of the signs simply weren't there, and in adulthood, they're still not here, right? The things that you would typically think someone with ADHD does or looks like. It's interesting to figure out where you fit in that spectrum, or I don't know, it can be a challenge to feel like this treatment or this diagnosis is for you. But I think knowing more people, just having ADHD be more of the conversation, and just neurodivergence in general, having that be more of a common conversation has helped me step back and see the unique ways that ADHD combines with other aspects of my personality that is, in a lot of ways, a little bit of a superpower. Um,
Mhm.
yeah.
Even just going about having those conversations with family or friends about your ADHD or the symptoms that you have as a result, uh, it can be difficult. And I know that I'm only on this path just more recently, within the past year, having these conversations with family members. And I know you've mentioned how you have a parent who is an educator, and that you are first generation American, and so the cultures that you've grown up with and kind of what you've been taught or what you've seen in terms of mental health around you. So I'm curious, just kind of bring it back to one of the questions I posed to you before, but like, what sorts of challenges did you have when you were going about talking to friends and family about ADHD, and how did you go about navigating those conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like of the mental health diagnoses that folks are familiar with, there's a lot of conversation now about the autism spectrum and what neurodivergence looks like, in that, and how it is on a spectrum. I feel like the stigma around ADHD is a little bit different from other mental health diagnoses, simply because I think more people are being diagnosed with it. It's just part of the zeitgeist, I guess, in a more prominent way, in a way that involves more diverse voices and folks who deal with it. Um, I feel like I haven't really had any challenges. Let's be honest. If I haven't had challenges, or I haven't encountered any conversations where ADHD was presented as some massive roadblock or challenge that I couldn't overcome. Um, if anything, I think anxiety and depression carry a little bit more of a stigma that can be difficult to bring up in conversation, because it is one of those things that I think Trevor Noah calls it long-term sad. Like when you tell someone, hey, you're dealing with depression, you're basically telling them that you're going to be long-term sad. And so talking about those types of things without knowing an origin point, can be really tricky.
Mm-hmm.
ADHD, I feel like, because it does have so much to do with executive functioning, things
Mm-hmm.
that um things that propel us from A to B, right? All of the things that we need to be able to function in society. The ways that we overcome those things are strategies that are valuable to everyone, right? So if we think about, um, for example, the keeping of extensive lists, and they're color coded, and they're everywhere, and they're really extensive. Um, those are sort of results of ADHD that other people also have to deal with. So I think just removing the stigma around the conversation culturally has been really good. That process of sort of differentiating between which of my behaviors are a result of ADHD and which of my behaviors are just a part of my personality and the way that I navigate the world. Um, it's a lot easier now to talk about those things. So I don't encounter too many challenges with friends and family just because it is a more common conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. I personally, I'm realizing that more and more people are getting late diagnoses or diagnoses. I think that's the word
Yeah.
you say. And because of that, a lot of folks might be in this whole category, kind of like how you've described, where they're looking back in retrospect, like, oh, so that's what that was when I did this. Oh, that's why in my childhood I did this. Oh, like those sorts of conversations. So I do agree in the sense that it's a bit more easier to talk about it because there's more people who are getting this diagnosis. And it does definitely help with like your community when there's all these materials out there that you can share with them, as well as quick things on TikTok or even on Instagram if you use it to start and navigate those conversations for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
I also am a daytime talker, so my brain is slowing down in the
Oh,
evening.
you too? Great. Because, like, I've.
Absolutely. And especially since, as I'm figuring out self-employment, my schedule is up to me. And that flexibility
Right.
is great, but it also, can be challenging because routine is so important, I think, for managing symptoms of ADHD. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the evening quadrant of the day is not the quadrant of the day that my brain functions the best in. So, yeah.
So, Krista, in your experience, what improvements could be made to the mental health system to better support individuals with ADHD?
So in 2020, actually, when a lot of healthcare services were now shifted to telehealth, I was really excited, right? Because as a Black woman in Kentucky, you can be sort of limited to access to Black healthcare providers, let alone Black mental health care providers. And so the pandemic hit and folks are doing telemedicine, and I'm super excited. I get on psychologytoday.com and I start looking through the directory of potential therapists and psychotherapists and prescribers who could help me in this period of time where everyone is sort of taking a step back and saying, we need to focus on mental health more. Um, so here I am in Kentucky. I find a therapist that looks like they're going to match up really well with me. The values aligned, their areas of expertise aligned. And so I send her a message, she responds, and is really excited. But then she lets me know, you can't actually receive my services because I am not in your state. And that
Uh,
that was brand new to me. I had never really thought about that or considered that because I had never really thought about approaching mental health in a telehealth setting.
Fair
So
enough.
here was this thing that was at all in one day. I was really excited and I felt like my opportunities had expanded and I was looking forward to being able to find a mental health care provider really directly who aligned with what I thought would be best for my healthcare. And then in the same day, getting a response and realizing that that wasn't going to be a possibility, it can kind of turn your head and
Yeah.
feel like you're getting whiplash a lot of times navigating the healthcare system. I'm not sure what the experience or what the limitations are in Canada for that type of thing, but and that's not to say that there are not healthcare providers in Kentucky. It's just the number of Black female healthcare providers, which is what I was specifically looking for, the number is limited and their calendars book up. And I feel very grateful to have formed a relationship with, these providers. I feel very grateful to have found and developed a relationship with healthcare providers that I really feel like are advocating for me. But I do think there are limitations that are just additional barriers. And I'm sure that there are, I don't know, you might know more about this than me. I'm sure that there are legitimate reasons for why you can't practice certain services across certain state lines. But at the time, navigating telehealth, because it was the pandemic, because I was living alone at the time, my portal was my computer. But even that, this tool that was meant to be really expansive and absolutely was, it wasn't as expansive as it could be. um and so I definitely saw it would be great to be able to expand in that way. Because a lot of people also, I have a lot of peers who don't want to have their healthcare provider be in their city,
Mhm.
because it is such a small pool.
Yeah.
Louisville has sort of that little big town mentality. It's not everybody knows your name, but it is a fairly tight-knit community in a lot of ways. And
Right.
find a healthcare provider that looks like you, who shares your cultural experiences, maybe there's a really good chance that you're about 2 degrees of separation from them, and you
Yeah.
might be, you might see them at the club the next day. And that can be a tricky thing to reconcile with. So yeah, I think, I'm really grateful. I have really great healthcare providers, but I think telemedicine provides this really unique opportunity for more expansive care, to reach people who maybe can identify with you on a level that those who are in proximity to you cannot. So I could definitely see that. Something else that I would say I have had a challenge with in my healthcare journey with ADHD or other, mental health diagnoses and challenges is I really want my providers to be a team. I want a team of healthcare providers who understand me and who can speak to one another. And I
Yes.
find that, I currently see maybe, let's see, let me count. I have at least three different institutions or organizations that are, no, it's four, at least four different institutions, private or otherwise, that I seek out for my healthcare, and they all have different systems, they all have different rules and regulations, and a lot of times they can't even pick up the phone and speak to one another. And so I find myself, or have found myself, being a translator in a space that I am not an expert in. And so not only is that a barrier because I can't fully translate this real medical information across my healthcare providers, it also just makes things take much longer in a process
Yes.
that really is built off of momentum. One day, my healthcare providers will be able to pick up the phone and speak to one another. And let me step back. They are able to do that now, but it was a long process. And, they're shifting their locations. And so I'm transferring my information from A to B to C. I think the opportunity to have more cohesive care across your healthcare providers would be beneficial.
Yeah. You know what? What I think the core issue is that these like Western medicine and just the structures that houses healthcare has
Yeah.
not caught up with the times and is properly utilizing technology. Telehealth is great because, to your point, for folks who might be remote, who might be, in an area where they can't necessarily access a specialist, they can call into the service and
Right.
get the support that they need where they are. And
Yep.
so even if there was a platform, and I get it, there's privacy laws and health care and such like that. And again, like just some of the similar things that you talked about are some of the similar challenges in Canada. Healthcare is governed by the provinces here. And so if you're licensed to practice in one province, it doesn't necessarily transfer over easily or you, like you can't do that. You have to find a provider here, especially if you are trying to put it through your extended healthcare insurance and get it covered. You have to have someone who falls underneath the governing body in that province confirm that they are licensed to practice in the place where you reside in order to get it covered. So there just seems to be a disconnect with how they can better connect technology and services to people and the transferring of information, that sort of thing. Definitely great suggestions that you've raised, that you brought forward.
Yeah, it sounds like there's very similar challenges when you cross boundary lines, no matter what country you're in. I will say that province sounds a lot nicer than state lines.
Ah.
Um, you know, feel
Yeah.
a little fancier at least.
Christa, you did mention about how you work with different providers for different aspects of your care.
Mhm.
And it just made me think about just the topic of self care.
Mm.
And I think this is a good way to kind of transition into that piece about the thriving piece. Like, can you talk about what does the role of self care and mental health look like in your life, especially while you're managing your ADHD symptoms? And kind of what I was telling you before we had the chance to connect today was that it's not a one size fits all approach, and it's not a one said and done thing. There's multiple aspects of it. So maybe if you have any nutrition or exercise routines or whatever that looks like to you, would you be
Mm.
happy to share?
So my healthcare routine is not the shining star of my story. But I will echo back to something that I started to talk about when we were discussing when I mentioned, the last quadrant of the day is not my best day for getting work done. Um, Routines are very important for folks with ADHD. I'm not an exception to that. I really enjoy puzzles. I really like jigsaw
Mm.
puzzles. I'm looking at one right now. It's very cute. I'll send you a link. But
Ah,
I don't know. Do you like puzzles?
yes. I just kind of like squealed when you
Oh,
mentioned
really?
that, because now I'm
Okay.
like, what is the picture of? Like, I'm just
Ooh.
curious now.
I am a puzzle fiend, so I really like artistic puzzles, puzzles that are small batch and like created by independent artists. So the image that I'm looking at, it's like it's a galaxy. It's abstract. It's got like a dance floor on it, but it's also got little mushrooms. It's monochromatic. It's just really interesting. And it's got
Okay.
different patterns anywhere. Anyway, the reason why I love puzzles is it's a project that you can finish. You have all of the pieces right in front of you, but there's still a decent amount of fluctuation and creativity that you can put into the method of putting the puzzle together.
Gotcha.
So one of the things that has been helpful to me as I develop my routine and as someone who is exploring freelance work as my primary method of sustaining myself, I try to look at my days in the week as sort of a puzzle, right? So maybe there's a chunk of time where this is where I focus on preparing my food for that day and I'll eat it and then put it away and then later for dinner I can come back and get it. Maybe there's a time period of time in the day where I a quadrant of my day where I'm really focused on getting stuff done at my computer. There might be a quadrant of my day that is focused on health and wellness. Maybe I'll drive to somewhere where I can go for a scenic walk or something like that. And just sort of having a handful, six or seven pieces of the puzzle that any day I can put into the order that makes the most sense for me has been a really valuable method of inching towards some version of a routine, if that makes sense.
Ah, you know what? You're onto something. I
Okay.
like the fact you even said, like, with puzzles, you have all the pieces to finish it, but
Right.
you can essentially pace yourself and finish it in the way that you want to and the way it makes sense to you.
Exactly. Sometimes some of the colors and the pieces will stay in that corner for a number of days. You know what I mean? You might not touch it for a while. But that's okay because it's there and you know what needs to be done to make you a whole person. So if I can find, my time during the week to make sure I get each of those pieces in, I feel a lot more consistent. And I think that's something that ADHD can really disrupt is that consistency and that kind of momentum.
I agree. Because, like, right now, I am in a full time job and I am magically, keyword magically, taking two courses that are graduate level
Oh,
on the side. Like, what was I thinking? I wasn't. That's what I was doing. I was just like, okay, well, I'm in a space and time where I can concentrate on work outside of work. So why don't I stack it up with two courses instead of one? Yeah.
mm,
So definitely my routine is out of whack for lack of
sure.
better words right now until I can figure out a better system. I'm
Mm.
only now starting to kind of take my head out of the water kind of thing to try and
Yeah.
figure out what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Krista, what milestones or achievements you're particularly proud of, like considering the challenges of living with ADHD or what you now know is ADHD?
I wake up every morning and feel if if I get one thing done, I try to give myself a pat on the back. And it seems a lot of times it can feel like, oh, I'm setting the bar a little bit too low. But on days where, your stress is intersecting with your anxiety and it's intersecting with, maybe you're having a bad hair day and I don't know, maybe you forgot to fill your gas tank up and so now you're going to be late to X, Y, and Z. Um, when you have a failing or when you mess up and it's due to your executive functioning, it really can knock you back and make you feel like a child. It can make you feel like the most basic things in your life, you're not able to achieve those. So I try to set the bar kind of low, but I I think of that as a useful strategy because that sort of lowest common denominator thinking can only be built upon. And I find that thinking in that way, setting a reasonable bar for myself in an area that I know I struggle with, I find that to be just another tool to promote consistency in myself and consistency in my sense of self-worth. I do celebrate those wins because some days it is about did I get the laundry done? Did I prepare my food? Those things are wins. So anytime I can step back and recognize, appreciate, and overcome some of the sort of aspects of ADHD that make me feel stagnant or ineffective or maybe naive or childlike. It's important for me to recognize, if a child is doing those things, that's a whole child, right? And so those things that you learn to do that become second nature,
Yeah.
those are still really important parts of existing. And
Hmm.
when you get those things in order, when you have those days where things seem to be falling into place because you're using your coping mechanisms, you're
Hmm.
using the tools that you've developed with your healthcare provider, those days feel really good, and they enable you to work on the things that are important to you that are outside of you. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because the inside and the outside, you're working on those things at the same time. But the inside can have a really it can color how you approach the outside. So making sure that I'm always giving myself grace and celebrating myself for existing, especially at the intersection of race, as a Black queer Kentuckian, those things in itself require a lot of patience and grace with myself. And so to add onto it this challenge of ADHD, which it can be a challenge, it could also be a superpower, but to celebrate those things that seem really basic, but that when those things break down, you really, really notice and you see how it affects your ability to focus on your values, to focus on the difference that you want to make in your community. Um, you see how important it is to give
Right.
yourself um, to pat yourself on the back for those things, because that's what sets you up to be able to be a functioning member of your community.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? Like even eh, just that, like I completely agree with everything you just said. I immediately just think to even what my therapist likes to tell me. Annette, you need to practice self-compassion. You need to
Mm,
be like have grace, be the practice gratitude, like writing down these small wins, but also how those small wins impact the larger picture.
yes.
Consistency, those routines that you have, how they all help you with managing your symptoms. And so I agree with what you said. um but yeah, it's the thing with since having this late diagnosis of like for me, it also gave me an opportunity to kind of just look back and appreciate some of the things that I did for myself in
Mm,
certain situations. Because I remember you had mentioned something about like using to-do lists and how everyone uses to-do lists, but I mean, like, if I don't have my to-do list,
mhm.
it's all going to fall apart. So for some people it might be one of those things where they can go without it, but I mean, like, it will actually fall apart. It's one of those things where I am not afraid to tell people, if you do not see me write it down, it's
Mm,
not happening. You need
mhm.
to text me what you want from the store, because if you don't text me, it's not happening. So like these these things you wake up and you do every day, taking a moment to just appreciate and be proud of the fact that you're doing them. And of course, wherever you are situated in the world, like, for those who are listening, you have to create those systems, those routines, what works best for you, but then also be comfortable with the fact that that you've you've set those things up for yourself. You've gotten this far, especially if you've had a late diagnosis, because
Yes.
you've gotten to this point
Yes.
because you had to figure it out.
And I think that's one of the things that the pandemic kind of brought to us, I feel like. You really don't realize how hard you've been working until those patterns are disrupted,
Ooh,
until your
yes.
routine is disrupted. And so I wonder a lot of times, if the pandemic hadn't happened at the same time that this national conversation about anti-Blackness and race is happening. And if that wasn't happening at the same time that I'm exploring what mental health care looks like for me and what ADHD means and looks like for me and how I structure my life around those things, it's really honestly, I feel like I have built up a reserve because of all of the work that we've done to this point. I mean, I am a young person, I'm 30, but if you think about how much your brain had been working to function in the way that all of the people around you are functioning, you got to give yourself a little bit of credit. Um,
Yep.
and as getting this late diagnosis, and like you, it's been less than a year for me. So I'm still really figuring out what that even means for me. But I do want to
Hmm.
remind myself that, like, hey, you got to this point because your body became exhausted, your brain became exhausted. And luckily, the entire world kind of slowed down at the time that you really needed to reset anyway. Um, and so it was that impetus. I think 2020 and the pandemic was sort of that impetus. I definitely think about my healthcare before the pandemic and my healthcare after the pandemic, and seeing how I've been able to navigate and be successful in the ways that I want to be successful, while also having a routine and an approach to things that is wildly different than I thought success would look like. Um, Seeing that you can achieve those things, but do it in a different way is really empowering.
And that's a word. Ding, ding, ding. I really appreciate this conversation, Krista. I feel like I was able to relate to you in terms of some of the things that you talked about on it as part of your ADHD journey, but also I appreciate the fact that you have that self-awareness and understanding that it's a ongoing process. And kind of like you, I very well, I call first off, I call the pandemic the panini press or the Panasonic, something, something like
Ooh,
different, some like add a little flavor to
I
it because it
like
just makes
that.
it like less like dreary.
A panini
Because
press.
that
Yes,
time of
we're
my life,
excited. We're
it
excited for
really
the
was
panini.
right. The panini press.
The
Hello.
resulting
Oh,
sandwich, delicious. It's a little messy, but
yeah, but
um,
that's it. But exactly that. It was the pandemic. You know, like all of the protests that happened, it just really changed my mindset and how I think about how I want to govern my life and how I define success. And that's when I became the biggest advocate for myself, as well as, um, starting to unlearn and relearn things because, man, those blinders were on thick. But I'm happy for where I'm at right now, and that, conversations like this where I can, share a little bit of insight, but then also just like hear from others and see like, you know, do they agree with me? Am I out to lunch? Are they experiencing it too? And it very much sounds like they're all experiencing it too. I think the panini press, kind of this pause. It
mhm.
There were some positives that kind of came out of something that was quite terrible in many places. But I know for myself, there it was a reawakening for me, and just how I see life moving forward.
Yeah. And I will say, just to be, I mean, my healthcare providers have been great. Some of the people that I've learned the most from about skills to help me with my ADHD have come from my Black female friends who do not have a formal diagnosis. So that's been really interesting as well, right? To see folks who prior to the panini press, um, were developing these coping mechanisms, developing these skills to harness the unique way that we approach and view the world. I've learned a lot from those folks, and I think that speaks a lot to how beneficial it can be to learn about different mental health diagnoses, even if you yourself don't have an official diagnosis.
Just one last piece before we part ways. What advice would you give to other folks who look like us, other Black, brown people of color who suspect they might have ADHD or recently diagnosed? Like, what advice would you give them?
I would say the most valuable thing to me is to see myself reflected in any issue or challenge or achievement and positive thing that I'm going through. The highs are even higher when you're able to communicate that with people. And the lows are more manageable when you're able to communicate that with people. So like I mentioned earlier, some of the greatest conversations, the most useful conversations that I've had have been with my Black female friends who have a lot of the same challenges that I do. And beyond that, are walking around in the same city that I am and seeing the ways that those challenges manifest in really specific ways. So that's something that I think is really important, is to be able to communicate with people who are sharing your as close to your experience as you can get. Like I definitely don't have any, Nigerian folks who grew up in rural Kentucky, who are now, that it's not that specific. I think my intersections, are not super complex, but are pretty specific. But just being able to hear from people, the visibility that this type of podcast, this type of conversation gives, I think is really valuable. That subreddit, for Black folks with ADHD is really valuable because you get to see, the conversations around what is quote unquote, the typical person who has ADHD, but then you also get to see within that same community a subsection that shares your experience even more closely. So just being able to see how other folks who look like you are navigating the same things that you're navigating, it really is, it cannot be understated, or overstated. What am I thinking?
Mm-hmm.
It really can't be overstated. Am I saying that right? Is that the right way to say it?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
yeah,
Sorry.
you're good. You're good.
Um, the value of being able to communicate with, or at least hear from people who share the same experience as you, or as similar of an experience as you can get to, that really can't be overstated. Um, so I really appreciate the platform to talk about it.
Well, thank you, Christa. I appreciate this, and I appreciate this conversation. I think there's a lot of great points that were made. And again, the conversation doesn't stop here. The conversation continues in your immediate circles. It continues online. It continues through other episodes in the Melanated ADHD podcast. And so thank you again, Christa, for joining us for today's episode.
Thank you so much for having me in this post Panini world.
Hey. And that's a wrap on today's episode. Thanks for tuning in to learn something new as you help us grow and contribute to the online discussions around ADHD. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Melanated ADHD on your favorite podcasting channels, and check out our social media accounts in the show notes. Until next time, take care and stay hydrated.